Your duty as doctors is to protect the health and lives of your patients. My duty is to protect the health and lives of 7.5 billion people, all of mankind. Your job is hard enough. Mine is that much harder. If I am to succeed, I need your help, and I am here to ask for your help. I protect the health and lives of the entire global population by finding existing and by identifying potential threats to human lives across the planet. I can therefore assert that I am the planet's doctor. I can also assert that I am the planet's cop, because I monitor not only the entire landscape of infectious disease outbreaks and non-communicable disease developments, but I also police the entire international system and every government on Earth. Because you see, the greatest threat to human health and lives is not posed by pathogens, but politicians, and not by pandemics, but policies. The system is ill, and it is sickening the entire world, both human and non-human. Having carefully examined my patient, I found that it suffers from multiple chronic conditions that together are life-threatening. If the system dies, it will take all of us down with it. And if kept alive by treating only the symptoms without addressing the causes of its many conditions, it will further degrade the genetic and intellectual endowment of our species and transgress the planetary boundaries that make life, all life, possible on Earth. As any good doctor, I am addressing the causes that make our system ill. Let me lay out my diagnosis of the system's state of ill health, and in so doing paint a picture of what is the system, how is it sick, why is it sick, and how do you fit in. The post-World War II international system, which is embodied by the United Nations Organization and started in 1945, revolves around two simple and rational objectives: covert depopulation and coerced globalization. The coerced globalization goal seeks to first eradicate extreme poverty worldwide and then increase prosperity in the developing world until it catches up with the developed world. To accomplish this, national sovereignty and democracy are bypassed so as to transfer control over natural resources from nation-states to multinational corporations and make them available across the world without prejudice. This is deemed necessary because natural resources are unevenly distributed, some nations being rich in resources while others poor. But all nations need to access them equally if they are to develop and prosper. National sovereignty and democracy are bypassed by vesting international bodies with political power and multinational corporations with economic might. The covert depopulation goal seeks to first stabilize the global population and then reduce it to a level that is sustainable and that has been calculated to be 4.5 billion. To accomplish this, fertility and immunity are subverted so as to limit births and manage deaths. This is deemed necessary because the planet cannot survive another doubling of the population from 7 to 14 billion people, which would occur in 20 to 30 years absent population control. Fertility and immunity are subverted by adulterating the basic elements of life, thus water, food, beverages, consumer and cosmetic products, with endocrine disrupting chemicals, as well as by manipulating medicine and public health, thus vaccines, drugs, treatments, and protocols, to act as double-edged swords. This, in a nutshell, is the system. How is it sick? To bypass democracy and divest national assemblies of control over resources, democracy itself has been weakened. National institutions and organizations have been rendered politically meaningless, and wealth has been concentrated in the hands of the 1%. The system has been corrupted from the top by its architects, who have hid its objectives behind secrecy and deception, and have pursued them through manipulation and obfuscation. As a result, people are no longer willing or able to participate in the political process, which has been taken over by self-serving and inept individuals who in turn corrupt from within an already corrupt system from the top, and as a result the world's problems grow more dire by the day. This is the globalization sickness, whose main symptoms are illegitimate governments, a deficit of leadership, an abundance of corruption, gross imbalances of wealth, an explosion of poverty and unemployment, abysmal dishonesty, dysfunctional institutions, misguided priorities, social decay, and shameless injustice. The globalization sickness has nearly killed the middle class, has destabilized the developed world, and has failed to stabilize the developing world, has forced millions to migrate, has impoverished hundreds of millions of people, and has shattered the social contract. The stress, poverty, and desperation caused by the globalization sickness have dire repercussions on both communicable and non-communicable diseases, raising their incidence and severity. It also has dire repercussions on lifespan and quality of life, arresting and even shortening the first, and worsening the second. To subvert fertility and immunity by covert chemical and biological means, governments have been perverted, the separation of powers annihilated, the rule of law suspended, a global police state instituted, the media silenced, civil society falsified, medical institutions debased, regulatory agencies bastardized, the military-industrial complex turned on the people, research falsified, industry co-opted, and the culture of death has insinuated itself at all levels of governance, national, regional, and global, turning the entire world into a theater of war, while medicine and public health have been turned into handmaidens of genocide. The system has been corrupted from within, and governments and corporations have been turned upside down and inside out. As a result, people no longer know who to trust and what to believe, as they are encircled by predators and are being decimated by the very institutions and organizations entrusted with their rights and liberties, with their health and dignity, and with their wealth and future. This is the depopulation sickness, whose main symptoms are a poisoned food system, a genocidal government, criminal leaders, duplicitous policies, police state controls, the annihilation of fundamental rights and liberties, and an explosion of chronic illnesses that are entirely man-made. The depopulation sickness has rendered 60% of the developed world and 30% of the developing world chronically ill, has condemned 1 in 3 of the world's children to developmental disorders, has downgraded the genetic and intellectual endowment of mankind, has set back evolution, has prematurely killed 500 million people, has prevented the birth of 2 billion babies, most of whom died in their mothers' wombs, and has made mass murder the choice solution for every problem of every government. The constant bombardment of the global population with toxic food and beverages, adulterated vaccines, and sterilizing drugs for population control purposes has caused the epidemiologic transition, is making every generation sicker and feebler than the previous one, and is threatening the very survival of the species. It has also devastating consequences for our lifespans, which will plummet over the next 2 decades to levels not seen since the Middle Ages if the system of covert depopulation is not stopped, and for our quality of life, which is increasingly defined by disease and dysfunction. To make up for its failure to stabilize the global population and to eradicate poverty, the system has started to interfere with the atmosphere in the hope of halting global warming and speeding up the death of the baby boom generation. This geoengineering attempt plays Russian roulette with the stability of the Earth's geophysical systems, which are poorly understood but brutally interfered with, turning the entire planet into a grand and reckless experiment by irresponsible and idiotic scientists, relying on computer-generated models that are about as accurate as the palm readings of fortune tellers. Nature itself is being deliberately corrupted to make up for the unwitting corruption of nature since the Industrial Revolution. As a result, people no longer know what a blue sky looks like, what clean air feels like, and how to safeguard the clarity and integrity of their own minds. This is the decarbonization sickness, whose main symptoms are a colossal waste of human and material resources, a suicidal hubris, a complete lack of accountability, opaque skies, asthmatic children, a rapid and mass degeneration of eyesight, and a global epidemic of degenerative brain disorders. The decarbonization sickness has rendered our air, soil, and open water sources contaminated with hazardous waste and persistent organic pollutants, coal ash, aerosolized aluminum, and Welsbach materials. What the consequences of this suicidal experiment will have on human and planetary health is anyone's guess, because no one has the knowledge to project this. What is certain, however, is that the consequences, for human health at least, will only be negative. So much for how the system is sick. Now let me address the question, why is it sick? Why can't globalization, depopulation, and decarbonization, which are planetary security prerogatives, be accomplished by legal and honorable means? By means that do not make us and our world sick. Any rational human being agrees that these objectives are necessary and unavoidable, which is why they are global policy. And any irrational human being has no business making policy. It is therefore not the lack of rationality that prevents the accomplishment of these planetary security prerogatives by legal and honorable means, but other obstacles. What are they? Let me start with globalization, defined as the sharing of resources across frontiers according to supply and demand and unimpeded by national, ethnic, cultural, religious, or any other prejudices and preferences. The sharing of natural resources requires their redistribution according to need, as opposed to their distribution according to where they are found. National self-interest and personal greed stand in the way of the redistribution of natural resources and the goods manufactured from them. Resource-rich nations do not want to share their resources with resource-poor nations and the rest of the world, but want to benefit from them first and foremost. And technology-rich nations do not want to give their know-how away to technology-poor nations and the rest of the world, but want to benefit first and foremost. So it is a question of who owns and who controls resources and know-how, thus a question of who benefits most. The battle of redistribution of resources from the national to the global level is a repeat of the battle of redistribution from the rich to the poor within nations, a battle that took centuries and is still ongoing, but that has been largely resolved through taxation. Taxation, however, cannot resolve the battle of redistribution of resources from the national to the global level, because there is no global government or central tax collection agency for the entire planet. Because the political structure for the redistribution of resources from the national to the global level is missing, what could not be accomplished politically is being accomplished economically, which is why multinational or transnational corporations were allowed to seize control of resources and to manufacture and distribute them across the planet, and why corporations have become so powerful and important. Governments needed only to agree on removing the tariffs and duties that stood in the way of the distribution of resources across national frontiers, and to change their laws with respect to ownership and exploitation rights of natural resources and to access to markets, which is why capital liberalization and foreign investment were unlocked starting in the 1980s. In addition to nationalism and greed, the other enemies of globalization are differences in political, legal, cultural, and business structures, which make the global sharing of resources as difficult as mixing water and oil. Or, to use a simile that doctors will better understand, it is like trying to get a body to function with different blood types. To make the transfusion of different types of blood from one body to another possible without killing the host or without triggering the body's rejection mechanism is as difficult an undertaking for medicine as is the exchange of resources from one country to another for economics. Global policymakers have been trying to institute universal legal, economic, monetary, and political rules to facilitate the distribution of resources between nations as easily as within nations. This effort is still ongoing and nowhere near complete. Only a global government, or at the very least, a planetary well-being authority, can complete this process of political and economic integration and homogenization, just as only a global government can overcome the obstacles of nationalism and greed. Unless we create a global government or a planetary well-being authority and endow it with the highest standards, the world will continue to hobble along, and poverty, inequity, and injustice will never be eradicated, as neither will armed conflict and the waste of precious resources on the projection of military might. As doctors, you cannot do much to advance the formation of a planetary well-being authority, other than support or join my organization, the Center of Global Consciousness, and help me realize this long-term goal. I could certainly use all the financial and technical help I can get. What you can do in the short term to soften poverty and share resources, you are already doing through the World Health Organization, the WHO, which is to institute a system of basic healthcare worldwide so the poorest of the poor across the world also have access to medical care. Unfortunately, the WHO's effort is driven more by the intent to involuntarily sterilize people across the developing world and only secondarily by genuine care for their well-being. As such, there is a lot you can do both as individuals and as a profession to keep the WHO honest and to rid the organization of its hidden population control purpose. You can do the following. 1. Scrutinize all directives emanating from the WHO or its 6 regional offices, either directly or indirectly through national ministries of health, especially those concerning child and maternal health, which is the front behind which governments and the UN system subvert fertility and, if need be, immunity to limit births and accelerate deaths. Beware that all vaccines, I repeat all vaccines without exception, have been adulterated to subvert fertility, and that is especially true for any vaccines administered to people 12 years or older. The human papillomavirus, the HPV vaccine, is a particularly obvious example of a population control vaccine, its true and main purpose being to prevent teen pregnancies. Even childhood vaccines cannot be trusted, as they use CRISPR-Cas9 gene editing technology to reprogram children's reproductive systems by altering gene expression or by silencing genes. For details on this subject, I point you to my peer-reviewed and open-access article, Turning Nature Against Man, The Role of Pandemics, Vaccines and Genetics in the UN's Plan to Halt Population Growth. 2. Scrutinize all treatment protocols and medicines supported by the WHO for combating infectious diseases, especially malaria, and refuse to follow any that have even a hint of involuntary sterilization. Beware, for instance, that the WHO guidelines for the prevention and treatment of malaria employed by the World Health Organization's Global Technical Strategy for Malaria 2016 to 2030 uses a 4-pronged approach: artemisinin-based combination therapy, indoor residual spraying, long-lasting insecticide-treated bed nets, and integrated vector management, and that all four components deliberately use chemical and pharmacological compounds that are known anti-fertility agents and have little or no use for combating malaria. This is especially true for artemisinin, which is a sterilization poison created by China's military. For details on this subject, I point you to my peer-reviewed and open-access article, Behind the Mask, Malaria Eradication and Involuntary Sterilization. 3. Put pressure on your professional organizations to issue public statements that doctors will not cooperate either with the government or with the UN system and NGOs on any and all programs hidden or declared intended to combat population growth without the express permission of the patient. This will force the system to come out into the open and pursue population control through legislation by legal and honorable means that empower the individual to assume control over reproduction and limit it according to the law. I have armed you with the legal ammunition you need to impose your will on your professional organizations and governments by convincing the medical community to respect the patient's right to reject any and all treatments for themselves and for their children. In response, the World Medical Association, which comprises 112 national medical associations and more than 10 million physicians, has updated the professional oath doctors take to include the following sentence: I will respect the autonomy and dignity of my patient, thus addressing and rectifying the lack of recognition for the patient's autonomy and ultimate say in decisions concerning their own health and the health of their children at a time when governments push mandatory immunization programs that are hidden population control programs. For all intents and purposes, we have cut off the hands of the depopulation lobby because our genocidal governments can no longer force depopulation by vaccination on us under the pretext of public health, and use doctors to force us to accept medical procedures we do not want because we know or suspect them to have hidden objectives that harm, not help our health, and have indeed nothing to do with health, but with the geopolitics. For details on this subject, I point you to my peer-reviewed and open-access article, The Subversion of Medicine and Public Health by International Security Prerogatives. 4. Organize and seize control of national ministries of health. Purge them of depopulationists and add to their mandates the prohibition to engage in any and all actions and programs intended to control population growth. For the legal ramifications of the knowledge you now possess with respect to the existence of a secret program of population control and the duty to protect within the ambit of existing Good Samaritan laws, I point you to my peer-reviewed and open-access article, Restoring the Rule of Law, Legal Implications of Covert Population Control Measures. So there is a great deal you can do to bring at least the health aspect of globalization back to decency and sanity, thus back to legal and honorable means. What about depopulation? What are the obstacles that stand in the way of depopulation by legal and honorable means? Depopulation being defined as the reduction of the global population to a level that is sustainable, thus capable of living from renewable resources without destabilizing the geophysical systems that make life possible on Earth. The system respects a jurisdictional order wherein religious authorities define the moral parameters of society. Political authorities make rules that conform to the moral parameters defined by religious authorities, and legal authorities enforce the laws made by the legislative branch of government. The operating principle of the international system with respect to population control is encapsulated in paragraph 15 of the encyclical letter Humanae Vitae on the regulation of birth, which states, I quote, On the other hand, the Church does not consider at all illicit the use of those therapeutic means necessary to cure bodily diseases, even if a foreseeable impediment to procreation should result therefrom, provided such impediment is not directly intended for any motive whatsoever." End of quote. In other words, governments can sterilize their people so long as they do it in the process of healing them of a disease. Hence, our water, salt, and milk are fluoridated to purportedly combat tooth decay. Our staple crops have been genetically modified to purportedly combat vitamin deficiencies. Our children are being medicated for invented mental and developmental disorders to purportedly make them normal again. Our foods and drinks are adulterated with hundreds of endocrine disruptors to purportedly improve their nutritional value. Our foods and drinks are bottled and packaged in plastics to purportedly spare us from bacterial infections. Our bloodstreams are being poisoned with dozens of vaccines laced with dozens of nasty compounds to purportedly save us from this, that, and the other invented pandemic, and on and on and on. This is the moral loophole created by the Church to justify the commission of genocide and enable secular authorities to combat population growth and defuse the overpopulation bomb by involuntarily sterilizing the masses so as to prevent the moment of conception. It is on these 3 lines of text that the entire program of population control rests, and why medicine and public health are the fronts behind which this program of population control hides, and why medicine and public health have become the handmaidens of genocide, and why despite the largest expansion of healthcare in history, we are not healthier but sicker, and why infectious diseases have been replaced by chronic diseases as the primary cause of death, and why 60% of us suffer for decades, have no quality of life, and prematurely die from chronic diseases. And why our nation's population pyramids have changed from pyramids to inverted pyramids. The median age of the developed world has jumped from 20 to 40. There are more pensioners than children. The old age dependency burden has quadrupled. Medical costs have exploded. Hospitals are overflowing, and every government is in the red. And why I went to Rome twice and hungered at the doorsteps of the Vatican for 45 days in 2014 and for 60 days in 2016 to compel the Church Fathers to change their doctrine on birth control and stop inciting governments to use covert chemical and biological methods to prevent the moment of conception, and to instead allow governments to encourage the use of contraceptives so the people can assume command and control over their reproductive systems, and governments and the UN system no longer have to poison us into sterility and morbidity. The Church is ultimately responsible for the depopulation genocide, and the Church is the prisoner of its own doctrines and conservatism, the doctrine of papal infallibility, and the refusal of its rank and file to grow up and move out of the way. But I cracked the Church, and the Church has changed its leader. And its new leader, Pope Francis, has softened the Church's position to contraceptives, and is in the process of reformulating the Church doctrine on birth control. He has also created the space we need to convince the world that henceforth mankind must assume responsibility over the sacred task of controlling population growth and limiting it to a level the planet can tolerate. In addition to religious conservatism and pig-headedness, an equally mighty obstacle to the pursuit of population control by legal and honorable means is democracy itself. No leader can be elected to high office by running on a platform of population control, which is why democracy has been bypassed to be able to institute the program of population control. The system is sick because of our religious values and democratic governance, thus because of our greatest assets. This is the great paradox of the population control conundrum. But I cracked this obstacle too by providing scientific evidence of covert methods of population control, by refusing to be silenced despite 8 arrests and the systematic destruction of my life, career, and family, by taking every leader of every nation involved in covert population control to task and shaming them in front of the world, and by confronting every international and transnational authority from the World Health Organization, the UN itself, the European Union, corporations, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Gavi Alliance, and all others involved in the depopulation genocide. I went to war against the world and won, and I have not fired a single bullet. As a result, governments have moved out of the way. I am no longer being arrested and harassed. My computers are no longer being burned. My information no longer censored. My efforts no longer undermined. The entire system is helping me now create the conditions necessary for the blossoming of a grassroots movement strong enough to provide the political impetus for population control legislation. I hope you will join this movement by becoming members of my organization, the Center of Global Consciousness. To speed up the process of transitioning from covert chemical and biological methods of population control to overt population control legislation, thus the enlightenment and empowerment of mankind to assume the awesome and sacred responsibility of controlling human life on the planet to a level the planet can tolerate, we have to disable the current methods of population control and educate the public. I therefore ask the following from you. 1. That you regain control of your professional organizations and bodies. 2. That you weed out corrupt doctors from your ranks and strip them of credentials. 3. That you refuse to administer any and all vaccines until our governments declare publicly that the vaccines they mandate by law and are compulsory are not used for population control purposes, and that the ministers of health and the prime ministers and presidents of every nation that make vaccines mandatory put their freedom on the line should the vaccines mandated be adulterated for depopulation purposes or are found to have such effect. And that you identify all procedures, protocols, treatments, medicines, and vaccines that are double-edged swords, in other words, that have a hidden depopulation purpose in addition to a known and honest purpose. Having forced governments to remove their depopulation poisons from our food and beverages, a process that is well on its way and will be completed by 2020, they are attempting to replace covert chemical methods of population control with coercive biological methods of population control. Hence, the new mandatory immunization laws and the explosion of vaccines that we are to be injected with throughout our lifetimes in order to limit our fertility and longevity, so that governments can reach their depopulation targets and then keep births and deaths in perfect balance the way a rancher does with his cows or a shepherd does with his sheep. But we are not farm animals. We are rational beings, perfectly capable of assuming new responsibilities as citizens of the world and planetary beings. So we have to shut down their mandatory immunization programs and eliminate their people from positions of authority to seize control of the top, of government and regulatory agencies. We will not be forced to accept a system wherein 1. Immunity against childhood diseases is contingent on accepting vaccines that also program children for compromised immune and reproductive systems. 2. Pensions are contingent on accepting flu vaccines that send us faster into our graves, which is why governments insist that public servants are immunized. 3. Parenthood is contingent on accepting chemically and biologically induced limits to our family size, which sicken us with chronic illnesses and cripple our children. They can no longer turn man against man by manipulating us to poison each other with food, water, and drinks adulterated with endocrine disruptors. So they instead turn nature against man by using the latest genetic technology to reprogram our bodies for sterility and morbidity. This is not the kind of world we want to live in. This is not life worthy of human beings, but of farm animals, and We're not animals. Only population control legislation in the form of a replacement level fertility law, assisted suicide, and optimal population levels can legally and honorably solve the population problem once and for all. Replacement level fertility will ensure that the population is stabilized in perpetuity. Assisted suicide will ensure that we survive the last stage of the demographic transition, which is characterized by old age dependency burdens that are too heavy to bear by the working age population, while the number of the old is still growing and the number of the young is still decreasing. And optimal population levels will ensure that every nation can live within its means without posing a threat to its neighbors and the world at large. Optimal population levels will also ensure that mankind itself reaches a state of harmony with nature and is no longer a threat to the integrity of our planet's life support systems. The faster we accomplish this, the better off we will be. What about decarbonization? What are the obstacles that stand in the way of decarbonization by legal and honorable means, and that keep in place a program of geoengineering that sprays us like bugs with hazardous materials with predictably negative effects on our health? Decarbonization being defined as the process of transitioning from reliance on non-renewable carbon-based resources to renewable resources such as wind, solar, hydro, geothermal, biomass, radiant energy, and tidal and wave power. Why can't the system divert investment from non-renewable energy sources to renewable energy sources and accomplish this vast transition within 2 or 3 decades? Who or what stands in the way of this rational choice, because it certainly isn't lack of technology or manufacturing prowess? I will keep this section short because there isn't much you can do about it as doctors. But for the sake of completeness, I will furnish you with the basic facts. I have identified 4 culprits. 1. The Russians and OPEC countries. 2. Big oil and big gas. 3. The automotive industry. And 4. The war industry and NATO. Russia and the 14 nations that make up OPEC, namely Algeria, Angola, Ecuador, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Libya, Nigeria, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Venezuela, resist decarbonization because the bulk of their revenues come from oil and gas exports. If the world transitions to non-renewable energy sources too fast, oil and gas prices will plummet and their economies will collapse long before no one will need their precious resources anymore. Big oil and big gas, the likes of BP, Chevron, ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, Total, and Eni, resist decarbonization because they have huge investments in the extraction and processing of fossil fuels, investments that will not mature for decades to come. They stand to lose their shirts and face bankruptcy if the transition to non-renewable sources takes place faster than they can collect profits from their current investments in fossil fuels and gradually transform themselves in renewable energy companies. The automotive industry is invested in the external combustion engine, thus in cars that run on fossil fuels. To transition to cars that run on electricity, on hydrogen, or on hybrid technology, they have to recreate themselves and change their entire manufacturing processes and technology. Such a change is difficult and costly, and requires huge losses of profit and huge new investments at a time when the car market, which is already overly saturated, and in an industry where profit margins are slim and precarious. And the war industry and NATO see their existence threatened by decarbonization because they exist primarily to secure the international channels of oil and gas production and distribution. If the world no longer needs fossil fuels, the world will no longer need the war industry and will have limited use for NATO too. As you can see, it is deep-seated political and economic forces that stand in the way of decarbonization. How these four economic and political forces can be appeased is beyond the ambit of this presentation, so I will conclude here by asking you to heed my pleas, which are: 1. To regain control of your professional organizations and bodies. 2. Weed out corrupt doctors from your ranks by stripping them of credentials. 3. Refuse to administer any and all vaccines until the heads of state and government publicly guarantee that no vaccine is used for population control purposes and retract their mandatory immunization laws. 4. Identify all procedures, protocols, treatments, medicines, and vaccines that are double-edged swords and have a hidden depopulation purpose. 5. Scrutinize all health directives emanating from the WHO, its 6 regional offices, ministries of health, and governments to identify their hidden population control objectives and force these entities to stop manipulating medicine and public health to serve as handmaidens of genocide. And 6. Put pressure on your professional organizations to issue public statements that doctors will not cooperate with any entity, governmental or non-governmental, public or private, bent on combating population growth without the express consent of patients. We need you on our side. We need you to be guardians of our health and lives and not unwitting depopulation pawns. We need to trust you again and to trust medicine and public health. We need our doctors. We need you.